Amie Siegel. Welcome to Design and Dialogue.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on the program. We're super excited to talk to you. You really represent a very different kind of voice from those we've had on the program up until now, insofar as you were really a practicing fine artist and are treating design more as subject matter, I would say, rather than as a profession. And I'm looking forward to getting into that in some detail with you. First, I just wanted to ask you one simple kind of question to begin with, which is what in fact attracts you to designed artifacts like chairs, to buildings, the architectural built environment as the topic that you are taking on in your work?
Well, thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Lucy, for organizing this, and Friedman Benda for the invitation. I would start by actually taking issue with the idea that design is a topic in my work. I can see how one would get there, and it's not a bad place to be, but I think it's an entry point among many. And I think that perhaps some of the more pointed concerns might have to do with a more sociological address. So design or architecture or psychoanalysis or whatever it is that feels like the first layer of the piece is really an entry point into considering the kind of more sociological concerns at hand. So in that instance, objects, artifacts, furniture, museum objects, collections, they become a kind of indicator of what we consider important and what we privilege, and how display practices indicate those things, or collecting practices or marketplace practices. So that's really what I'm interested in, is I'm interested in us more than the objects, and sort of the objects are a way to get to us. Yeah. Without ever having the humans, let's say, really present or foregrounded, like in this kind of storytelling protagonist way. Like you always need a human protagonist to identify with and resolve at the end. Like I'm just kind of skipping that entirely. This just nothing to do with really my interest.
Yeah.
So that kind of sociological kind of connection is really, I think, where I tend to come in. That's the entry point.
So could I turn that maybe back to you in one way, and we'll start looking at some images in 1 second, but this is a super interesting topic to me. I totally understand what you're saying, that design is only one of multiple entry points, and also that the ultimate subject matter of the work is kind of what humans do and the spaces that we make around us and the sociological structures of that, those kinds of very large scale phenomena. I guess I wonder whether designed objects and buildings might be an unusually fertile material to work with, insofar as they are already so connective and so systemic in their origin, in a way that, for example, an individually made painting might not be. Would you buy that argument?
You're saying systemic in origin because they reflect a whole like system of practices? Yeah, I mean, it's not the object, it's the context of the object, right? So it's not the individual chair or the individual Freud object that he's collected or piece of marble. It's the context of how, of the system itself. So the context, or the system becomes the context in the sense of whether it's a marketplace. So what I'm really interested in is sort of the economic undercurrents, let's say, or the psychological undercurrents of why we collect, or how value is even created in the first place.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm coming at this from a place where, I work with many different mediums and media, but I'm not partial to any of them. I'm like a complete medium slut, like I'll kind of go with anybody. But only in the sense that it has to be connected to the project and the piece. I'm really interested in how various mediums and media bring with them a whole set of predetermined concerns, the history of the media, how it's used professionally or by artists or industrially or in the domestic setting, or like home movies, like all the things that all the associations that we bring to a medium, like painting or sculpture or film or video, et cetera, or within film, 16 millimeter versus 35 versus Super 8 versus high definition versus, all these different factors, they are akin to what we bring to objects in a way. That objects come with all of this kind of baggage at times. And you can one can deploy those concerns and work with all of that context. And I think that's more of the space that I'm coming from, is how to tap into those associations and then redeploy them so that your point of view around the object or the context starts to shift because something about that is revealed. So, for example, like with Provenance, what's revealed is the whole economic structure and the place from which they come, the design objects that are featured there. Or with Dynasty, it's the marble, and we'll get to that in a minute. But so Provenance is a multi-element work. And I like to think of my work as that all of the works in some way kind of perform the behavior of the system that they describe. So they take a system and create a kind of representation or description of it, but at the same time become almost like an object within the system themselves in order to question their own place in the world as well. So in this instance, we have Provenance, which is this 40-minute film about the furniture that Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret designed in Chandigarh, which you can see here in India, which is a city that was created in the first moments of kind of India's independence. And not to get too far into that history, but my work, Provenance, this main film, the 40-minute film, it moves backward like a Provenance document. So a Provenance document is a document that accompanies any artwork or object deemed of cultural value, and it starts in the present with the current owners of the object, and then it moves backward in time through kind of the history of ownership of the object. And so my piece, Provenance, follows the same structure in that it starts, if you move ahead in the images, you can see it starts in the homes of the collectors who bought the furniture either at auction or through dealers, etc. If you keep going, so that's like a house in the Hamptons. This is a home in London and Notting Hill. And then it moves back to where you see the furniture in the collectors' homes to the preview auctions. So the exhibition, so if you go back one to the photograph, that's the furniture being photographed at Right 20th Century in Chicago for their auction catalog for an auction that contains some of the furniture from Chandigarh. And then so it goes from the collectors' homes to the auction preview exhibitions and all the work around that to the preview exhibition itself. This is at Art Curial in Paris. This is an installation view of Provenance at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but within the image, the inner rectangle is the projection wall where you see Provenance, and you see this kind of space that's quite contradictory to the sort of modernist anthropomorphic forms that Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret designed with those two chairs and the lamp. It's in this kind of different, almost like Beaux-Arts space in France. Incredible. But and then so it moves backwards from there. So we went collectors, preview, exhibitions for the auctions to the auctions themselves. And you can see that the furniture goes for the significant, that's a starting price, not a hammer price. Right. And then backward again from the auctions to the so-called restoration of the furniture in Europe. So it's already left India and it's in Europe now being restored, which sometimes means all that's left perhaps is a single screw from the original piece of furniture. And then backward again, if you can go ahead, yeah, back to the furniture itself in Chandigarh, which you sometimes see piled up, like here, a whole bunch of chairs just kind of discarded. Or if you keep going, maybe there's another. Oh no, there isn't, but we saw them in the beginning. So back to the context, the original context of the furniture in India. Mm. And then, as sort of referring back to that idea of the piece performing the behavior of the system it describes, I arranged for Provenance, which is an edition of 5 of the video, to be auctioned itself at Christie's in London. And I filmed the auction of my piece, and that becomes the video that you see on the other side of the wall. So you walk into the exhibition, if you go back one image, and you have Provenance projected on one side, and then going again to the image, you see the auction of the very work that you just saw in a work all about auctions. And then I think there's one more image, yeah, of that. And ironically, when I auctioned it, and I had nothing to do with it except to ask them to auction the piece, and then Christie's auctioned it, and then it went for the hammer price was actually pretty akin to the kinds of prices that the furniture got, ironically, at that time and since then. So there was a sort of a strange, very true completion of that circle.
Yeah. So there's a lot to talk about here. I suppose one thing I wanted to ask about was your own position in this set of implications and contingencies that you've mapped, because of course you've placed yourself there very explicitly by fielding the material of the auction of the work itself. So there's this kind of echo chamber resonance to the overall experience for the viewer. One thing that occurs to me about that is that it sort of breaks through the traditional boundary that we might make between this idea of medium specificity as a kind of formalist interior concern for an artist. In other words, the painter only thinks about the conditions of painting, and their concerns sort of stop at the edges of the frame, that kind of modernist idea from the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Uses that same idea of a kind of internally directed material specificity to actually become a very externally facing, indeed very broad consideration of a whole number of market forces, material flows, etc. Do you feel like that's a good reading of the work? And what do you think about that kind of relationship between the like the centripetal and centrifugal dynamics of the project?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting to consider the project becoming, the piece itself becomes a subject of its own system that's being, depicted. So it's somehow, the way I think of it is it sort of enters the system itself. And the reason that came up, it's not because I've decided that there's this formal way of working and I want to work that way. It's, I mean, that's some aspect of it, but I think the true motivation always comes from the work itself. Like the process of making the work proposes the terms of the work at some point. And very early on in making Provenance, I realized, for me, I think researching the kind of design market and the auctions and the dealers and where those Jeanneret and Corbusier pieces ended up revealed that the spaces where they ended up also contained a lot of contemporary art. And so it brought into question my own sort of relationship to the market cycle, the market system. And I started to think about, the typical system of, the work is shown, an artist's work is shown in a gallery or an exhibition, and then it's bought, and then it's perhaps resold and ends up on the secondary market, right? And the secondary market is where it's resold, whether it's through a private dealer or through the auction world, right? So the auction world is not primary market, it's secondary market, always. I mean, used to be it, let's say. It still is for 99% of the time. And so I tried to think of my own system of exhibition and selling and editioning of the work as like a radical compression of what usually takes place over like 100 years or 50 years or 10 years or however you want to think about it, a longer period of time into like 6 weeks. So the first place that I showed Provenance was at the gallery I worked with in New York, Simon Preston Gallery. And if you go forward, I think a picture, you'll see that what I showed there was the main film Provenance, and then this piece here, which I'm going to talk about, because I had arranged for the Christie's auction. The Christie's auction that Provenance would be in would be only 1 week after my New York gallery show closed. So the piece would go from primary exhibition, primary market to secondary market within 6 weeks, which is already a radical condensation. But the way to represent the auction to come became this work here, which is called Proof, which is and it's always exhibited with Provenance. And it's the Christie's catalog. It's the proof. It's the printer's proof of the Christie's catalog page, auction catalog page for Provenance that I had embedded in lucite. It sort of floats inside this object. And that way it sort of represents the auction to come, And so when you went in the gallery, you had this sense of something that was to come. But what happened, which was so unpredictable, is that, Provenance is an edition of 5 with 2 artist prints, 2 APs. And by the time I had set aside the first in the edition to auction at Christie's, but by the time the New York Gallery show closed, all of the other editions were gone. They were sold. So what happened at Christie's was like, it was really like a sort of a stroke of luck in the sense that it created like a market frenzy around the last remaining edition, so to speak. So, you have a media work that's edition of 5 and 2 AP, and then suddenly there's only 1 left. And
it's so fascinating because, of course, the story of the chairs from Chandigarh is in some ways a story of manufactured rarity
yeah, exactly. And, that's sort of going down a different road. But when I was in some of the dealers' warehouses, in France or in Belgium or elsewhere, I would see tons and tons and tons of the furniture. It's like when the retail store only puts out like 2 of the same shirts, maybe 1 in a medium and 1 in a small.
Yeah.
But in the back they have like 10 of each size, but they would never put out 10. In certain stores they would never put out 10 because they want you to feel that you're getting the only one. And it's classic, retail psychology.
Yeah.
I grew up, my mother had clothing stores, so like I'm very familiar with retail and sales psychology, and it seems like no different. In all of these supposedly kind of hierarchical worlds. Like, in fact, it's quite similar.
Yeah. So let me ask you one last question about Provenance before we move on. And this is something that could be applied to so many of your works. And I know it's something that comes up a lot in critical response to your work. And in fact, it is a question about criticality. So it's a really simple question. You used the word revealed a couple of times as we've been talking. And it seems to me that there is certainly a kind of clarity and a transparency that you're providing to the viewer, a sense of understanding something or witnessing something that they would not otherwise have had access to. Access, again, being a major...
You mean in terms of revealing hidden processes?
Yes, among
yes.
others. And I guess the question I have for you is whether you feel that that is an inherently critical practice on your part, or whether it stops short of critique as a kind of explicit act on your part. Whether you're...
No, of course it's critical. Absolutely. I mean, to look is critical. To represent is critical. I mean, and acts of representation are critical.
Okay.
I mean, they can be for the most. They start, I think, from that point, and they can either, exaggerate that or go deeper into that in more explicit or even more subtle ways, you know, depending on who the artist is. In my own work, I think the path is always trying to get at things through an implicit means rather than an explicit means. You know, and I things like voiceovers, etc. For me, they're like a kind of they're their own mode of operation, but they've something that I've employed in other works that are kind of more like theatrical works or works that are more essayistic at times. But I'm most interested, I think, when the associations are created by the editing, you know, or by the juxtapositions of objects in the work, or by the creation or terms of how the work is made, you know, and not put forth in a kind of more explicit way.
Yeah, like these self-referential aspects where the work in some way mirrors the content of the work that we were
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes from my own, like, sort of selfishly, the way that I like to view artworks, you know, and that I want to figure things out, you know. I'm like, I want to be the psychoanalyst who comes in and figures it out, you know, at least from my perspective. Right. And I like doing that work, and I think as a viewer and as somebody who looks at a lot of art, that's the experience I enjoy. It's extremely pleasurable. You know, being told things is like sort of less pleasurable. On that, I mean, it feels like a sermon, you know, and I'm not a very good churchgoer, so you know.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention to the next project, which is called The Architects, and we'll only have a few images of this one. Highly pertinent, again, to the series that we've been undertaking here at Design and Dialogue. I would describe this, and agree or disagree, as a kind of forensic examination of the professional landscape of architecture. That might be one way of describing it.
I could go with that. I mean, you keep asking me whether I like your descriptions, but what I like is that they're your descriptions, and it's always a pleasure to hear what people get from something. You know, in a way, like it's almost not as relevant, you know, as what I gave you the work, you know, there it is. So, but I think the forensic is the key word that you're trying to put across, or that you've put across. And I think that's really interesting because the work is structured kind of like a vivisection, or I guess what you would call in architecture like a section plan. You know, that it's like you have a building and you're cutting away the building from the side, or you've cut the body. And I know this is kind of gross, but like I'm from Chicago, and at the Museum of Science and Industry, they have a vivisected horse. And so that's like that kind of viewpoint is like a little bit of an space for me, but that you're kind of cutting away and you're seeing something and you're kind of moving by it in a lateral way, which is something that I'm interested in general in my work. But in this instance, it's the offices of various architecture practices around New York. And this was a piece that actually was a commission. The Storefront for Art and Architecture was doing the Venice Architecture Biennial that year. They were representing the US. And they had this project called Office US. And they asked me if I wanted to make a moving image work connected to the architecture office. And I, you know, I always sort of hesitate when anyone comes to me with anything like a topic. But at the same time, you know, I'm interested. So I was interested enough to go and look at the offices. And when I did, what I saw was these, like, if you go back to the prior slide, I mean, you can see it here, but just this like sort of endless desks, these lateral desks. And I was kind of fascinated by them because, you know, I associate that with like downtown stock market finance world of the 80s, like the sort of endless Bloomberg registers, you know, along the desk. But also just that sense of the kind of parallel tracking that it would afford. The sense of that I realized then that what I wanted to make was a factory film, which is a factory film is sort of a genre, I think, close to a lot of people's hearts who are interested in film. Yeah. Because, you know, the moving image and factories and sort of the industrial era came about at the same time, and the first films were done at factories, in fact. And there's a history of factory films, and I thought it would be very interesting to look at the architecture offices and take that as a sort of starting off point. That's not to say that they're factories, you know. It's more of a kind of a mode to begin from, to look at. Even though many of them do employ what feels like sort of countless numbers of people doing very, very, like, I think the digital equivalent of piecework, which is like literally doing like digital, like I'm working on the ductwork of a building. Yeah. And like all 12 of us are working on it in this, you know, this area of the office.
Yeah.
That's a kind of like an equivalent of doing like factory piecework.
And the tracking shot also gives you a feeling of an assembly line, like you're sitting on an assembly.
Yes, of course. And then, thank you. That's exactly right. So the formal aspects of the piece also kind of present that endless assembly line.
And then another thing that comes up, or at least for me, it came up a lot in the film, is the issues of scale. So you have architects sitting in architecture, for starters, as
yeah.
architects inhabit, but also models are a very important motif in the film. And so here we see one being photographed, but they also perform various roles in the film. I wonder if you could talk about the issue of model making and scale in the film.
Yeah, well, I mean, architects' offices are fascinating because you sort of expect the architect's office to be this like stunning space of design, and yet they're like it to me, I really identified with the mismatch, because like people come to my studio, and I'm out in Connecticut now, and my other studios in Brooklyn, and I tend to keep this one, as you can see, very sparse, but my studio in Brooklyn is just a total mess. And like, I love it, and I know where everything is, and it's an organized mess for me. But I think people come to my studio and they expect to see like design objects, or, you know, like that every chair has a kind of history. And I always find that extremely amusing, because it's just a productive mess in a lovely way. And it works for me. It's very functional. And I, in a funny way, I felt a real empathy for these offices, because I could see they were like just offices on some level. They didn't present these sorts of perfect visions of aspiration of design or architecture. And that was really interesting and sweet. And they also would kind of scale up or scale down based on the projects they were taking on. Like sometimes they might be really small spatially, and other times they might rent out the whole floor of their office buildings because they had a big project. But the models themselves, yeah, they're interesting because they're architecture inside architecture, which is always fascinating as a kind of like a meta moment, you know. And that comes up, for example, again in Quarry, which we'll talk about. But also the model making itself, which you see in the film, the actual making of the models is so different, because almost every, I mean, the one place, this is really fascinating because I think Bob Stern's office, Robert Stern, has this kind of reputation of being extremely, the architecture itself is being very conservative and slightly neoclassical, maybe not on the avant-garde side. And yet that office is the office that's making their models out of clay, which is in a way a kind of conservative viewpoint, but it's also like an extremely materially driven one that is really lovely in its dedication to materiality. And you sort of see that happening. But it seems to me that many of these models, perhaps this is what is being suggested by this image here, are made to be photographed.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a kind of an interesting thing. It's almost like, you know, the most, I don't want to say snarky, but like the obvious contemporary version of that would be like the plate that you eat, that you cook and make, or you're at a restaurant or the restaurant makes Instagram friendly food. It's sort of like the models at times felt a little bit like that, like they existed to be represented. They are already acts of representation, but they're not going to be sculptural like we expect.
Mm. I often have had that thought about designed artifacts in the postmodern condition in general. Like, you know, if you think about Memphis furniture from the 80s, for example, that was absolutely made to be photographed, almost like props for a set, really, and very limited in its actual physical dispersal into the market, but extremely pervasive as a image field, you know. So there's
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sensitive, I think, as an artist who, you know, works with a lot of different medium. I'm also very sensitive to objects, small objects on pedestals, or just small objects placed in, like how they're placed. Like, it always horrifies me to go into a museum and see the pedestals pushed against the wall, because you can't go behind them and you can't view it as a dimensional object. You're really being told that you can only view it from the front and a little bit from either side. You know, or you go in and you see, I was at a show recently with some really lovely sculptures, and you went around to the back, sort of like you went around them, but you realized they actually had backs, meaning they had parts that were sort of less interesting, which was also interesting and didn't make them lesser works. It just made them works that addressed issues of front and back in a sculpture, which is really curious.
totality, yeah. Well, let's move on, because we have a few more projects to look at yet. So here we're coming on to double negative, which again, much could be said about this project. Maybe you could briefly describe it first, though, for those who haven't seen it.
Yeah, I mean, like Provenance, it's one of those works with multiple parts, but the main element, so what you're looking at is Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, but it probably looks unusual. And if you go to the next image, the main part of the work is, actually, if we can go one more after that. I forgot the order here. So the first thing you see in this work is a double projection. And these are 16 millimeter projectors that are in fact placed on a pedestal in the middle of a room and projecting opposite sides of the room. So they're kind of together but facing in opposite directions, these two projectors. And they're projecting the Villa Savoie basically in negative, but yet one of them is projecting a white image of the villa, and the other it's black. And that's because in making this piece, or the reason I started on this project, Double Negative, is because I realized that there is a group of architects speaking of architects, in Melbourne, Australia, who built a copy of Le Corbusier's gleaming white Villa Savoie in black in Canberra, Australia. And I was just fascinated by the idea that they would make this kind of almost like an Antipodean negative version in the other hemisphere, right, of this well-canonized work of residential architecture, modernist architecture by Le Corbusier. And so I went there and I decided to make this piece where I filmed both Villa Savoies with 16 millimeter black and white film. And so I filmed the black one, I filmed the white original in France outside of Paris, and I filmed the black one in Australia. And then I asked my motion picture film laboratory to to print them as negative. And so in that instance, the white turns black and the black turns white. So what you're looking at is actually a negative image.
Yeah.
And so they kind of invert in that way. And then as you move on in the piece to the next kind of adjacent area, there's a color video projection where you see the same sort of shot structure that you saw in the black and white. But in the color video, which has sound, unlike the black and white, which is silent, you go inside the buildings. And so inside the white Villa Savoie, it's the Villa Savoie. It's a museum unto itself, right? But inside the black Villa Savoie, very different things are unfolding. And that is because inside there, if you go one more, the building houses the Institute for Australian and Torres Strait Islander Studies. for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies. So that's basically an ethnographic institute that has a huge deposit of films, photographs, slides, audio recordings, all kinds of ethnographic media that anthropologists have deposited there. And they even have some objects. So whereas you see, for example, chairs being photographed like supermodels in Provenance, and the models, the building models being photographed in the architects, here you're seeing sort of indigenous artifacts being photographed inside this building, and also film being transferred and audio being transferred and slides being digitized. And what fascinated me about this, you know, I mean, I'm sure you can imagine, but in part was the idea that a building whose program or agenda is, or a building whose formal sort of identity is as a copy, has itself become a space where its entire program is dedicated to copying things, to moving analog media, all this ethnographic material, to digital. And you know, there's a lot that could be said about that, but I think we get away from issues of design and more into issues of object conservation and questions around you know, self and other
Right.
in this zone. But this sort of connects to issues around it's sort of taking the, and I think this would be a good instance, you know, of like design is like really absolutely a jumping off point, but you land somewhere very, very different here. And where you land is in these concerns that have to do with, you know, once upon a time, the films and sound recordings that anthropologists made of other cultures, you know, around the world were called salvage ethnography, because supposedly they were these documents of cultures that were disappearing, but disappearing because of contact with white Western culture. And, you know, that term is very problematic and debatable, but what's fascinating here is that the very artifacts of salvage ethnography, all the films and media itself, becomes a kind of salvage media, you know, in the sense of salvage ethnography becomes salvage media, because now the thing to save that's disappearing is the media itself. So you can't play the films anymore, you can't play the sound recordings, you have to move them to digital.
Right. So there's a long story there about authenticity to be told. I guess for our purposes, it might be good also to focus on the activities within the building and then the building itself and its status. One thing I was interested in discovering when nosing around this project is that the Black Villa Savoie, as it's often called in Canberra, has been called the evil Villa Savoie, or the Darth Vader version. And also there's a sort of pseudo controversy about whether it's a kind of illegitimate ripoff rather than a kind of intelligent and intended repost to the original building.
Yeah, can you go back? Do you mind going back to that first image where it's kind of full screen?
We see it, yeah.
I mean, you can see it here. Yeah, I mean, maybe we can stay on this one. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and you know, the piece, you know, delves into. But I think the first thing maybe to say is that I think in our Northern Hemisphere worlds, or at least the spaces where canonized works of Western art and architecture are available, or at least present, because these are the geographic spaces, you know, where they are, like France, Europe, North America, etc. There's a kind of coming in contact with the original. Whereas postmodernism, as I've come to understand it, in other parts of the world, like Australia or New Zealand, in fact, very interestingly, engaged in a kind of a different mode of address, where their relationship to postmodernism became so much about things represented or even misrepresented in photographs. So if you can imagine the condition of being in a place and studying all the canonical works of Western art and architecture, but never seeing them in person, because you're so far away. You don't have access, et cetera, et cetera. So what you have are books, you have photographs. You might have photographs where the images are printed wrong in reverse, as sometimes happens, like backward. And in fact, that was the case sometimes with the Villa Savoye, that the architects told me that when they came upon it, images, some of them had been reversed. And so there's this idea of kind of purposeful misrepresentation, I think, that came across, or that they tried to get across in their copy. I don't think the copy is, that they wanted to make a copy as an homage.
Right.
I think it was a sort of an act of questioning. And this building is also part of a whole apparatus of building that they designed, which is the National Museum of Australia. And so it's one part that's a kind of a private institute, that people can have access to, but not without making an appointment, where there's the whole museum is over here. And that, we can go into a longer conversation about this another time, but that whole museum is itself a copy of, or at least, I wouldn't say a copy, I would say it references Liebeskin's Holocaust Museum in Berlin.
Oh, okay.
So there's very quite specific allusions being made to genocide, oppression, etc., of peoples in these buildings. And I think that, thinking about terms like evil or the Death Star of the Villa Savoye perhaps brings with it problematic ideas of associations with Blackness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's really troubling in a way. But I think also that there's a different history in terms of Aboriginal identity in Australia than other identities of color, in the States and elsewhere, such as like I think it's the New Zealand, not Australian, football team is called the All Blacks. There's I think there's many kind of facets of cultural associations that one can come to with this. But my interest was really in the building itself as a kind of presentation of a copy whose own program was then doing the work of copying media.
Right. So again, that kind of refractory logic that appears in your work.
Yeah.
May I suggest we move on to Quarry?
Yeah.
So I'm really eager to talk about this project, which again traces a pathway or a passage of materiality from one place to another, beginning in this absolutely amazing place, this quarry in Vermont. So maybe you could again walk us through the sort of script or the program of the film.
Yeah, so Quarry is, I think it's about a 30-minute video installation. And here you can see this is an exhibition view from South London Gallery. And so it's, the way I show it is on a floating screen. And the screen sort of roughly approximate like a sort of a scaled up version of a slab of marble. Somewhat in its dimensions. But here you can see on the image already, we're inside the quarry. And the quarry is the largest underground marble quarry in the world. And it's in Vermont. And, that sounds kind of epic when I say it, but at the same time, there are not a lot of quarries that are underground. They're usually mountainside. And so this is also a very unusual quarry because, well, it has a tremendous history that goes back quite a long ways for Americans, which is, a lot of Washington, D.C. was built out of this quarry. But now this quarry's main activities is providing marble for the facades and interiors of kind of luxury developments around Manhattan and even Brooklyn. And so that was sort of fascinating to me. And this quarry unusually has within it, here you can see sort of some of the lower recesses of the quarry where they've taken out the stone in quadrants. And this is, I think, a really interesting image because you can see the whole sort of flow of the layers of the stone in a dimensional way, even though it's a flat image, and it almost feels when you're down there like you're in a room, a marble room, because every single surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor is marble, and it's quite uncanny, and there's these kind of eerie work lights down there. And so the quarry has many spaces in it, but it also has a factory in it. It contains its production within itself, which is fascinating. So here we're still in the parts of the quarry that are where they're carving out the stone. And now this is an image from the kind of more factory floor where you're getting a little higher up. I think the quarry goes about 1 kilometer deep from the entrance. So here you're closer to the entrance, let's say, and you can see that they're sort of stacked the sheets of marble there. But the first half of this piece all unfolds underground in the quarry, where you see the very practices of the quarry being cut and honed and, brought basically to manufacture. And then in the second half of the film, you see where the marble is deployed in the various, they look like real apartments, but they're in fact the speculative model apartments built by developers to show you residential buildings or residential apartments in residential buildings that have yet to be built, and to sell them. And usually these apartments are kind of fascinatingly built inside office buildings. So you have this kind of, you take the elevator up to a certain floor, and then you enter into a showroom of a space that's, completely different. And here you can see some of the marble deployed. If you go forward.
Full-size version of the model.
Yeah, so this is one of the apartments. And I think what's interesting about this shot and the still frame that we're looking at from the shot is both the model apartment, the model building of a building yet to be built, which is actually just off to the right where it will be located in Chelsea. But also, if you look closely, you can see that there's both kind of brushed gold and silver windows. There's 2 windows. So the silver windows are the windows of the office building, and the brushed gold is the representation of the window of the building to be built, that they've built inside the office space.
And of course, the modernist grid that appears in the architecture, for example, in the model at the left, might remind you of the Quarry grid that you've just seen. So I think
that's interesting.
For those who haven't seen the film, that music is also a very important part of it. So as we're underground, and then again in the apartments, we're hearing Holst's a passage of Holst the Planets Neptune movement.
Well, it's it's different fragments from that piece of music. But I think thanks for bringing up the music, the sound, because I think one of the important things is that there are fragments from the score that come up in the first half of the film, and then they're repeated exactly in the second half. So it's sort of like the same motifs pushed through a different filter. And as you go further and further into the second half of the film, the images that are presented start to blur between whether they're real, so to speak, or they're renderings.
Yeah. And so it might take, at least for me, it took a minute to clock that I was looking at something that was in fact a digital, speculative digital rendering.
Right, which is part of the work that I hope a viewer would do. So here we're looking at an installation view of the piece as projected and installed at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, a great exhibition space and a really interesting show curated by Nicholas Hirsch and Hilla Peleg and Jesko Faeser, another couple other folks, called the Housing Question, Wohnungsfrage, all about housing, which they had commissioned the piece. So originally, I should say, but you're looking at that building that we were just looking at. Actually, you're looking through the windows of the building
from the outside
of the model, but this is a rendering.
And of course, it also, there are passages like this where you start feeling like you're looking at a doll's house as well. Like this.
Yeah. I mean, you can see the gold, the gold from the windows inside here.
So, I'll just go back to some of these other images so people can dwell with them a little longer. Adrian Searle made a great point in his writing about this film, that there's a play in words of the title. So there's obviously quarry meaning the place where the stone comes from, but also quarry as in prey or something that's being hunted. And
Yeah, actually, I think that was Tom McDonough
was it okay?
first, I should say, in his essay, though I can imagine that Adrian Searle, who's the art reviewer for The Guardian, terrific person, also probably picked up on that as well. I can imagine independently. But Tom wrote a piece about Quarry very early on. And pointed out that double meaning of the sort of the prey.
Yeah, I guess it prompts a question for me about the again the idea of commodity flow, which again is mirrored in the horizontal gliding motion of the filmmaking. And there's even moments particularly in the quarry factory, where you think that the camera is panning, but actually it turns out what's happening is that the marble is moving in front of you and the camera is stationary. So there's a lot of play around that idea of horizontal movement. And I guess what I wanted to ask you about was the very fact of commodity chains as a subject that's arising in this work. Obviously, we saw it in Provenance as well. And maybe just your thoughts about the work as an index or exploration of that whole phenomenon, these sort of coursing movements of materiality and commodity that are happening all around us that we may not be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sort of after Provenance, the work kind of moves in multiple directions, two of which are, one has to do with, as we saw in Double Negative, that sense of, the kind of address of like modernist architecture in a non-modernist context, right? Such as, another hemisphere, another part of the world, another part of the culture. And then the idea of the objects, the sort of movement of object collections and the address of object collections, whether it's media or materials relating to, for example, indigenous culture and Double Negative. But another avenue that the work goes is this following the movement of material. Like literal physical, building material, not objects that have already been kind of culturally manipulated, such as, our religious artifacts or spiritual objects or everyday objects of a culture, like you see in Double Negative. So here the material is the marble, the sort of that interest in marble, which for me marble is so compelling because of all of the associations it brings with it that are connected to art history and ideas around classical sculpture and purity and the sort of strangeness of whiteness and marble and the kind of problematic discourse around purity that puts forward. At the same time, kind of fascinated in general, if you pull back a little bit from that, in the idea that marble can hold within it a kind of spirituality of great art because it's from the same medium as great classical sculpture. And for me, this came together. Sometimes when I embark on a project, I'm not actually really sure why I want to do it. I just feel intuitively really interested in it or connected to it. And I think that was true of Quarry. And when I was researching the project, I went to, for example, I didn't end up filming in there, but one of my visits to these kind of speculative build-outs of the luxury star architect building to come was a visit to, I think is it called 142 Park Avenue? The Raphael Vignoli building, one of the tallest buildings, if not the tallest residential building in New York and Manhattan landscape. And in while the building was being built, they had a showroom in another building a few blocks away in Midtown. And actually the one that's right above the giant cube Apple store. I forget which building that is. But in any case, when I went there, I went with my producer, Andy Fierberg, and we were sort of taken through as speculative buyers, so we got the spiel that the speculative buyers get. In fact, I think there was a couple that came through as well and sort of joined us moving through, and they tell you about the sort of window materials, and they show you the kitchen build out and like what are the scales of things. And then we went into the bathroom, and the bathroom had this massive chunk of marble that was the sink, and the basin was just a void cut into the solid or seemingly solid chunk of marble. I mean, it was really massive. And I was staring at it, and the sales representative from the building said, and in fact, this marble that you see here from, that constitutes the sink is taken from the very same quarry in Italy, in Carrara, where Michelangelo took his marble for the Davids. And I was just stunned because, of course, it seemed like, possibly not true, right, to say it gently. But also, I think what really stunned me was the direct appropriation of art and association to art to create a connection or a feeling that if you buy and spend, X millions of dollars on this, you will in fact be buying the equivalent of, you could buy the spiritual and ineffable achievements of great art.
Yeah, fascinating.
So that was the crux of it for me. And then I knew what the project really was, in that way.
So, Amie, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to advance to this extremely topical project, which has, I think, really strong resonance with what you were just saying.
Right.
So it's called Dynasty, and it's about our friend, the current president of the United States on some level.
Oh, yeah. So this piece is called Dynasty, as you said. And it's a piece made up of, I think, 4 different elements. And the main element is this fragment of marble, which you see here inside a vitrine. And when I made this piece, I was about to embark upon a show, an exhibition at the South London Gallery that would include Quarry and another work that we haven't talked about called Fetish, which has to do with psychoanalysis, and Freud's collection of 2,000 archaeological objects and artifacts. And I was aware that I wanted to make a new work for the show, but I didn't want it to be a moving image work like the other ones, and I wanted it to somehow be like a kind of that it could somehow encapsulate these interests in marble and in psychoanalysis that I had not yet, I think, felt quite fulfilled in the other works, but that it was still in my mind. And so I started looking around. Speaking of sinks and marble, I started looking around online. Like, what do people do? What do developers do? What do people do when they cut the basin from a piece of marble for a sink, and then like that piece that where the void now is, like, what do they do with that? Or what do they do with the rest of the, if they cut out shapes, like, what do they do with it? Like, is there a market for remaindered marble? So this was like the question that I went forth with in my research. And what I found instead was that I came across, I did this all in 2016, shortly after the election. And my show was, ironically, several months later, it opened right around the inauguration. So it somehow all felt very weighted by the election and the events of, late 2016, early 2017. And what I found online was somebody was auctioning off that fragment of marble on eBay, because the fragment of marble is a fragment from the Trump Tower lobby in New York. So if you go back an image, I think you sort of get the color a little better there. So that sort of salmony pink color is, the one that Ivana Trump, his first wife, selected for the lobby, and it's throughout the lobby. And at some point they renovated like a little part of the lobby that's more toward the residential side where the elevators are, and they put in like a kind of beige one. And I guess that this person had kind of traversed the length of, because you can pass through it, at least you used to be able to, from one side of the street to the other. would traverse it on their way to work or whatever, and one day kind of snagged a fragment years ago and decided now to sell it on eBay. So it was like, you know, I was watching it and it was really getting up there in price. So I decided I better buy it really fast. And I thought, well, I'm going to put it in a vitrine. And then what I did is I made these, well, first of all, the seller sent me an evidentiary photograph, which you can sort of see hanging on the wall back there. I don't know if we have a closer up image of that. Yeah, where he sent me this picture and then I made a print of it. And the picture is, you know, where the old marble meets the new marble. Like, I think is kind of proof that he was there and that it was actually from the building. And I loved that. I mean, I'm calling it an evidentiary photograph. He just called it like, I'm sending you this picture.
Yeah.
But then I also made, to go with these objects, to kind of create a constellation of objects, that giant Rorschach-like piece. It's 2 framed works, and what it is it looks like the thinnest like slice of marble, the same kind of marble, which is called breccia pernice, and is used often in northern Italian churches, and comes from northern Italy. It looks like a thin slab of it, but in fact, they're scans. So I went to, I found the marble and I found book matched marble pieces. So they're 2 different pieces from the same marble that's been cut and opened. So that pattern forms, you know, I mean, book matched marble is like, you know, it's all over shelter magazines and design stuff. But what fascinates me about it is that despite its sort of ubiquity in the design world, or at least the interior design world, let's call it, it still carries forth this kind of strange registration of like what we bring to it in the moment, our interior thoughts, our sense of what the moment is. And so I went to a marble yard and I scanned with a marble scanner that I ordered from China those pieces, and like you can only scan like about a yard at a time if you're lucky. So I scanned them and then I stitched them together, like back together in Photoshop, and then I made prints of them. So when you see them, they look like, people ask me all the time, like, how did you cut the marble so thin? But they're photographs. Yeah. You know, they're prints. And then the last part of the piece is the wall text, which is part of the work. You know, it's not just a caption. And the wall text really illuminates the provenance of each of these, you know, different elements of the work, but especially the marble fragment itself.
So it's interesting you use the word Rorschach, because it does seem like there's a kind of, there's certainly a very powerful analytic quality to this work. Like, here's this relic, maybe we could use that word, which also connects to those religious associations with the material.
Yeah, and relic, and like put in a vitrine, so that you're told by the language of display practices that this is a valuable object, it's a rare object, it's an object. I mean, it's just a little tiny fragment of marble. Yeah. You know, on the one hand, you can see the kind of funny cement where it was glued down on the other side.
Yeah, it does seem to me in some way to be a quintessential statement about the false value creation that is Donald Trump. I mean, it's so absolute laser focused methodology to getting to what he's really about, which is kind of what you see written out here in some way. It's like a
yeah, I think it was like the latent, my experience of making Quarry had so much to do with the latent presence of developers. Yeah. Like, they're not in the film, but they're the thing that motivates a lot behind the scenes, you know. And I think I had mentioned to you the story of, like, I would drive up to Vermont and I would arrive at the parking lot of the Quarry, which was like off of a road, off of a dirt road, off of a barely could pass by road. And there would be all the guys who worked in the Quarry would be their trucks, their pickup trucks. And then there would be like 1 or 2 Teslas parked there. And I would know then that a developer was visiting that day, you know, to select marble. And I think this sense of, I mean, that was like a fascinating juxtaposition, but I think I carried with me from Quarry, which was made in 2015, to Dynasty, made in 2017, that question about the developer.
Yeah.
And thinking of Trump as a developer, you know.
Yeah. Absent figure of power.
And also like the various people, including his wife, who were involved in the design of the Trump Tower, and the way that the family, which, I mean, at that time, one couldn't even predict that he would put family members in the White House, you know, and greatest acts of nepotism we've ever seen. You know, you didn't know that, but like thinking about dynasties and that 80s television show, you know, which was all about, you know, climbing up the ladder and getting to the scales of wealth and aspirative, you know, images.
So we're a little over time, but I just wanted to round out our conversation with these works, which are unfamiliar to me actually, which are, you described them to me as marble paintings. So can you just explain how this works?
Oh, yeah, they're marble dust paintings.
Dust paintings.
So these I just made last year, literally last spring. And this is an exhibition view of the works from the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston for a show I did there. And the way that these are paintings that I've made, and the way that they're created is, when I was filming Quarry, one of the things that I noticed is that when the cutters cut the marble, these large kind of almost like robotic cutters cut the marble, we can just stay on this image, they produce a tremendous amount of runoff, in terms of there's a lot of water used to cut the marble. And then the water combines with the sediment of the stone. And then when it dries, it creates marble dust. And marble dust is a main material that constitutes painting primers. Like marble dust is within most whiting, which is like the layer you put down before you paint, that you put down on the canvas before you paint, or rabbit skin glue contains marble dust. There are even chalk drawings made early on with marble dust. So I decided that it would be very interesting to make a series of paintings. I thought, like, how would it come out if I made a series of paintings that were created from the painting is sort of the luxury item of the art marketplace, in the sense of, you know, being of high value and can hang on the wall. It fulfills all kinds of, you know, aesthetic aspirations. And I love painting very much. It's not to sort of knock it, but I'm looking at it from this kind of more forensic side, to use your word, or sociological, to kind of use mine and say, what are the associations we have to painting? And for me, often it's like paintings that go for huge amounts of money at auction, et cetera. It represents a certain aspect of the art marketplace. And I was thinking, well, it would be fascinating to make paintings from the remaindered detritus material of a luxury medium such as marble. You know, so if you pair these two things together. So in fact, the way that these paintings are made is by my setting the canvases near the cutters, and they accumulate the marble dust on top of them. I have no influence on their imagery, their resultant patterning, other than to remove them at a time I feel is appropriate. So they, interestingly enough, some of them took on through the presence of water and the material of canvas that I use. So there are choices that affect things, but they're sort of like paintings that are made from industrial processes, as it were. But they have these kinds of, some of them have these kinds of latent images that emerge, or seeming images, you know, here, for example, somehow allusions to representation. And then some of them, if you go forward, you can see more the patterns of the cutters as they move across the canvases, for example. So they become even more representative of the process, the sort of industrial process of their own production.
It's fascinating because they again suggest that idea of a Rorschach blot that you would associate to, but also, despite the fact that they're not cross sections in any way in terms of how you made them, they also feel a little bit like a kind of cutting through of something, a cutting through at a moment of time, maybe a temporal cross section rather than a spatial one, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. It's like the effect of cross sectioning.
Yeah, exactly.
The what it receives.
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Like they've received the result of the cross section of the marble.
Yeah. Also makes me think of religious, like the veil on which Christ's face was meant to, the sudarium, the veil on which Christ's face was meant to have appeared.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that absolutely. I think because they the marble dust creates almost like this kind of glowing surround, and then there's something that emerges out of that, especially in the one we're looking at right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a very beautiful and, in a way, very meditative conclusion to our dialogue. We are a little over time, so I think I'm going to have to call it there. I will say that if folks are interested, there's this amazing talk that Amie did about Donald Judd's furniture, which is available, I think, still online, right, Amie, on Dia's website? Is that right? People can go and see that?
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely
Yeah.
still there.
So we won't take time to talk about that now, but in a way, it's best just viewed cold, just experienced in that way. But if you'd like to hear more from Amie, which I'm sure you would, um, at this
So
point.
we don't have time for any questions or anything?
Well, if there are any immediate questions, do let us know. I think people have been sort of listening and watching rapt.
That's sweet. I'm like, I need some dialogue here. But no, you've been great. So thank you, Glenn. This has
It's been
been
a
really interesting.
fantastic conversation. I hope the first of many. And I will announce that we have a really exciting guest coming up on Friday. Thaddeus Mosley, the Pittsburgh-based sculptor, is coming on and we'll be speaking with my co-host, Stephen Burks. So come back for that on Friday morning. Amie Siegel, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay.